The last time my family looked at me like I belonged in the room with them, I was 11 years old, sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table eating cereal before school, and he was reading the newspaper beside me in the specific, comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the quiet, because the quiet itself is enough. Everything after that was a slow, quiet drift toward the version of me my family found easier to manage than the actual one. And the drift was so gradual, so undramatic, that I was 30 years old before I had the right language for what had been happening all along. They hadn't been cruel. They hadn't argued with me or excluded me from events or said anything that announced itself clearly as rejection. They had simply, steadily treated me like a guest in my own family, polite, pleasant, fundamentally external, until I had spent enough years accepting the guest role that I had almost forgotten I hadn't chosen it. Then my grandfather died, and his lawyer called, and the final reading of his will required every member of the family in the same room at the same time, which was the first time that had happened in over 3 years. And what he left inside that room, not in the will, not in any document, but in the truth the reading finally forced all of us to sit inside together, was the most significant inheritance any of us received that afternoon. Stay with me, because what my grandfather arranged from beyond that table changed what my family was willing to say to each other, and some of what got said had been waiting 20 years for the right room to say it in. If you've ever felt like a stranger at your own family's table, subscribe right now, because this story knows exactly where you've been sitting. I need to take you back to the drift, because understanding it is the whole foundation of what the reading eventually broke open. I am the middle child of 3, which is its own particular geography, not the oldest, who carries the weight of firstness, not the youngest, who carries the warmth of lastness, but the one in the middle, whose position requires you to develop your own reasons for being noticed, because the structural ones have already been claimed. My older brother Marcus was the responsible one, the one who stayed close to home, who entered the family business, who made the kind of decisions my parents could point to with uncomplicated pride. My younger sister Lily was the warm one, the connector, the one who called everyone on birthdays and organized holidays and performed the social labor that kept the family's sense of itself as a cohesive unit alive and functional. I was the one who left, not dramatically, not with a speech. I just moved to a city 6 hours away at 24 for a job that turned into a career that turned into a life. And somewhere in the accumulating distance between that city and my hometown, the family's image of me calcified into the shape I'd been when I left and stopped, updating to match who I was actually becoming. I came home for holidays. I called on relevant occasions. I participated in the group chat with the dutiful consistency of someone, maintaining a membership they weren't sure they still belonged to. But the conversations at holiday tables had a quality I noticed, without being able to name. For a long time, they were about Marcus's business decisions and Lily's family and my parents' retirement plans. And when they turned, to me they turned in the superficial way of people addressing a topic they are not fully familiar with, asking questions. They didn't have enough context to make specific and receiving answers they didn't have enough foundation to make meaningful. I had become, in my own family, the one nobody really knew, not because they disliked me, because they had stopped doing the work of knowing me, the specific daily labor of staying current with a person who exists outside your immediate field of vision. And I had stopped offering myself for the knowing, because being half known had started to feel worse than not being known at all. My grandfather was the exception, because my grandfather had always been the exception. Edmund, the same Edmund from every version of this family's story, the one who read beside me in the morning quiet, the one who showed up for the people others forgot to show up for, had continued, in his 80s, to call me every 2 weeks, to ask real questions, to maintain a genuine current knowledge of who I was and what I was building, independent of what the rest of the family had chosen to know or not know. He was the thread that kept me tethered to a family I had otherwise become peripheral to. And when he died at 84 in the February of my 30th year, I felt the loss in 2 registers simultaneously, the grief of losing him, and the subtler, colder awareness that the last person holding the string connecting me to that family had just let it go. I flew home for the funeral. My family was warm in the way families are warm at funerals, which is to say warmly, undifferentiated. The grief organized everyone into the same softened, accessible version of themselves, and for 3 days I felt less like a guest and more like a member. Then the funeral ended and people returned to their particular distances, and I flew back to my city with the particular loneliness of someone who has just glimpsed what belonging could feel like and watched it close back up before they could get fully inside it. The lawyer's call came 11 days later. All named parties were required to attend the reading in person, per the terms of the will, and my grandfather had been specific about this. Specific enough that the lawyer mentioned it twice, which told me the specificity was intentional rather than routine. I booked a flight and did not tell my family I had been called, because the call had gone to me directly, and I was not yet sure what to make of that, and I had learned enough about my family's dynamics to know that information shared prematurely had a way of being rearranged before it arrived at its intended destination. If you've ever been the family member who learned to hold things close, because sharing them too early meant losing control of what happened to them, comment I learned that early below, because that particular lesson cost something to learn, and this story knows exactly what it cost. The reading was held in my grandfather's house, at the kitchen table where I had eaten cereal at 11 years old, which I understood immediately was not a coincidence. My grandfather had specified the location in the same document that specified the in-person attendance requirement, and both specifications had the quality of choices made by someone who had thought carefully about what this gathering needed to do and how the right setting could help it do it. My grandfather had been an English teacher for 30 years. He understood what rooms do to conversations, and he had chosen this room the way he chose everything, with the patient, deliberate precision of a man who believed that the right environment was half the work. My family arrived before me, because my flight was delayed, and I came directly from the airport, and I walked into that kitchen, carrying a carry-on bag and the specific composure of someone who has been in transit for 4 hours and is not yet ready for whatever is about to happen. Marcus looked up from his phone. Lily said my name with the slight, guilty warmth of someone who has not called in 3 months and is aware of it. My mother stood and hugged me with the full, real embrace of a woman who had not seen her middle child in 8 months and was allowing herself, in the proximity of grief, to feel that absence more honestly than she usually did. My father shook my hand and then, after a moment, pulled me into a hug instead, which was not his usual register, and told me the 3 weeks since the funeral had been doing something to his defenses. The lawyer was a young woman named Ms. Ndile, who had the composed efficiency of someone twice her age, and the specific quality of a person who had reviewed these documents thoroughly and understood that what she was about to read was not going to land in this room the way standard estate documents usually landed. She set her folder on my grandfather's kitchen table and arranged the documents and looked at all of us and said, "Before I begin, I should tell you that your grandfather left instructions for how this reading should proceed. He asked that his letter be read first before the distribution of any assets. He was very specific about the order." My mother looked at my father. Marcus put his phone away. Lily reached for my hand under the table, which surprised me enough that I looked at her, and she was looking at the folder with an expression that told me she had not known this was coming either, and I understood suddenly that none of us had known that my grandfather had arranged this room, with its specific participants and its specific order of events, without telling any of us what we were walking into, and that the not telling was deliberate. Miss Ndile opened the letter and read it in the measured tone of someone who had prepared herself for this. My grandfather's voice came through, it with the particular rhythm of a man who had spent 30 years teaching language and had saved his most important language for this. He wrote that he had watched his family for 84 years, and that watching a family was its own form of education, and that what he had learned from watching ours was that we were people who loved each other more than we knew how to show each other, and that the gap between the love we had and the love we expressed had been, over the decades, quietly costing all of us more than we were aware of paying. He wrote about Marcus first, about the weight of being the responsible one, of having your reliability taken as a given until you forgot that you were allowed to need things too. He wrote about Lily, about the exhaustion of being the connector, of holding a family together through the sheer force of your own social labor, while rarely being held yourself. He wrote about my parents and the specific, bittersweet experience of watching your children become people you sometimes didn't fully recognize, and the grief of realizing the distance had accumulated while you were busy with other things. Then he wrote about me, and I want to tell you what he said, because it was the most seen I had felt in that room in 20 years, and because I think some of you reading this need to hear someone say it in whatever form they can access it. He wrote, "My middle grandchild has been a guest at this family's table for long enough. I have watched this happen gradually, and I said too little about it for too long, because I told myself it wasn't my place. And I have spent the last year understanding that was the wrong decision. It is everyone's place to say when someone they love is being made to feel like they don't belong. It was my place. I should have said it while I was here to say it. I am saying it now because late is better than silent, and because I am asking this family, as the last thing I will ever ask of it, to do the work of knowing each other that you have been deferring for years. The work is not complicated. It requires only that you choose to do it. Choose." The room was quiet in a way rooms almost never are, not the quiet of people holding back, but the quiet of people who have had something said to them so accurately that there is nothing left to position against it. My mother's hand was over her mouth. Marcus was looking at the table, with the particular expression of a man processing a truth that is going to require him to change, something about his behavior rather than just his feelings. Lily was crying openly, without the usual management she brought to public emotion, and I was sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table where I had eaten cereal at 11 years old, holding the letter in my mind like something I needed to keep very still so it didn't break. Ms. Deal read the asset distribution after a pause, that she allowed to go on longer than was strictly necessary, which told me she was a person who understood that some documents need time before the next one can be heard. The house to be sold, proceeds divided equally between all grandchildren, personal items allocated specifically, a small monetary bequest to my parents, and a separate envelope for me, not money, not an asset, a collection of letters. My grandfather had written to me across the 2-week calls of the last 7 years, printed and bound and sealed, covering the full account of who I was and what I was building as he had understood it. The complete record of a person being fully known by someone who had refused to let distance become the relationship. I held that envelope for a long time before I opened it, and when I finally did, it was late that night, alone in my old bedroom, in the specific quiet of a house that was still his even though he was gone from it. Reading those letters was the closest I will get to sitting beside him at that table again, and I did not rush through them, because some things deserved to be received at the speed they were given, and he had given these slowly, over 7 years in the patient, consistent way he gave everything. What happened at that kitchen table after the reading was not a transformation. I want to be honest about that, because transformation implies something sudden and complete, and what actually happened was slower and smaller and more real than that. We sat together for 4 hours after Ms. Ndili left, and we talked, not about logistics, not about the estate, but about the things my grandfather had named in that letter. Marcus said, in the careful way of a man unaccustomed to personal disclosure, that he had felt the weight of the responsible role for years and had not known how to put it down. Lily said she was tired, in a way she couldn't locate, until she heard my grandfather describe it, and that being tired and still being the one who held everything together was a combination she didn't know how to stop. My mother said she hadn't known I felt like a guest, said it directly to me, and her face when she said it was the face of a woman who had received information that hurt her and was choosing not to deflect the hurt outward. My father said less, because he always said less. But he said, "I should know more about your life than I do. Tell me something real about it." And I did. And he listened for the full length of what I said, which was the most complete thing he had offered me in years. I fly home less often now, but stay longer when I do. The difference is significant. Visits that are measured in days rather than weekends, with enough time in them for conversations that go past the surface and into the actual. My mother calls on Tuesdays, which is not a holiday or a birthday, just a Tuesday, which is the most meaningful part. Marcus and I have had 2 conversations in the last year that were genuinely about something. The weight he carries, the weight I carry, the specific experience of being a sibling who developed their full personality in a different city and has had to reintroduce themselves to people who thought they already knew them. Lily and I trade voice messages now rather than texts, because her voice is warmer than her typing, and mine is too. And some things need to be heard rather than read. I keep the bound letters on my bookshelf, between 2 books my grandfather taught me when I was 20, which is where he belongs, between the things he gave me, holding them apart just enough to let the light through. I read one occasionally, not in grief, but in the specific, grounded warmth of someone who is reminding themselves that they were fully known by at least one person, and that being fully known leaves something in you that nobody can take back, not even the silence that came after, not even the years of being a guest at a table that was supposed to be yours. He asked his family to choose. We are choosing imperfectly with the particular effortful honesty of people who spent years choosing the easier version and are now learning what the harder one requires. My grandfather taught for 30 years that language was the most serious business there was. He proved it at the end with a single letter read at a kitchen table. And the business it did in that room is still, every day, being completed by the people who were sitting around it. If this story moved something real in you, if you've ever been the family member who felt like a guest, or the one whose grandfather refused to let you disappear, or the person sitting at a table, hearing something finally said that should have been said years ago, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. The cereal at 11, the letter, or the Tuesday calls. I read every single one. Subscribe now for more raw, real, unforgettable stories about the families we belong to and the moments that remind us we still do. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story. And stay close, because what I'm bringing you next is even more powerful than this, and you do not want to miss a single word.